Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am pleased today to be joined by members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Working Group on Prison Telecom Reform. Also here with us today, who we are trying to get into the room, is Mrs. Martha Wright and her grandson, Mr. Yerlandis Fort, who will talk about their experience with the high rates of prison calls and the impact it has had on their lives. You all know, and if you don't know, let me tell you why this is so important to us. Exorbitant inmate telephone rates, as much as $4 per call, plus an additional 55 cents per minute charge for long-distance calls. Frequently, these kinds of fees force many families to make very difficult decisions about whether to forgo contact with their family or loved ones or to do something else because the cost becomes prohibitive. A number of studies and feedback directly from inmates and their families all point to a powerful correlation between regular communication between inmates and their families and a measurable decrease in prisoner recidivism rates. Understand that. If they can communicate, the odds are much better that they will not be repeat offenders. So today, the CBC is here to urge the FCC to eliminate their per-call charges, to establish a reasonable per-minute rate cap for debit, prepaid, and collect calls, and to examine the needs of prisoners with disabilities. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who will provide more detail to the CBC's response to the FCC's notice of proposed rules making. And I thank you for being here.
Well, I thank our chair, Marcia Fudge, for the attention as chair that she has placed on this very important issue for the Congressional Black Caucus and for the work of our task force, the members of the task force you see behind me. The lady to my right is Mrs. Martha Wright. Mrs. Martha Wright, more than a year ago, brought a class action suit for herself and her grandson, who is with her, and his name is Yerlandis Forte. Ms. Wright has essentially converted her love and devotion to her grandson into a search for fair phone charges for families and inmates. I want to thank Ms. Wright, who's the hero of the day, and Mr. Forte for their diligence through more than a dozen years now, to the point that we are, with the petition now pending, a petition which Ms. Wright sought first in court before the Federal Communications Commission. Her own experience, you will later hear, of prohibitive costs in making calls to her son, who was incarcerated among several different facilities of the Bureau of Prisons, all of them miles from their home here in the District of Columbia. Also here is Ms. Celestine Johnson, also a D.C. resident. Her son is currently incarcerated in a facility of the Bureau of Prisons. The interest of the Congressional Black Caucus and the task force, whose members are here this morning, starts with the conclusive evidence, long documented, that of all the approaches to reduce recidivism, to promote reintegration into civil society, communication from and between family and loved ones while the person is incarcerated stands out above all others. Now, the CBC is leading this effort for all incarcerated persons. But it's interesting to note that a group of people came over this morning hearing about this press conference who have nothing to do with the Congressional Black Caucus. All of them are out there and all of them are white. Our interest, of course, comes from the fact that 60% of those incarcerated in state and federal prisons in the United States today are people of color, and 40% of these are African Americans. Among these families are also a disproportionate number of low-income Americans. And when you consider the correlation between income and incarceration, you can perhaps understand our concern that the burden is excessively put on those who can least afford it. Communicating to loved ones in prison, of course, costs the government nothing. But what the government reaps from family support in reduced prison costs and in reduced crime is incalculable. But what we have, and the reason we're here today, is because of government-commissioned monopoly contracts for inmate calling services that result in profiteering on the one hand and kickbacks to mostly state prisons on the others for use at their discretion by prison officials. This, of course, is a horrifically unfair disadvantage to both the families and the inmates who are without any effective recourse except through the Federal Communications Commission. Our Telecom Reform Task Force has strongly urged, and I want to make this point, has strongly urged the FCC to take complete jurisdiction because the Congress has given it jurisdiction over intrastate and interstate calls. Now, normally, as you know, the FCC does not have jurisdiction over intrastate calls. But for purposes of inmate calls, Congress has recognized inmates in state and federal prisons as a distinct national population. That's what it did when it gave FCC explicit authority, and I'm going to give you the words of the statute, to prescribe regulations that establish a per-call compensation plan to ensure that all payphone service providers are fairly compensated for each and every completed intrastate and interstate call, Section 201B of the statute. And of course, the statute says that these calls must be just and reasonable. So what we have here is a virtual monopoly dominated by two companies that allows vastly different phone rates. And obviously, they're using these rates for kickbacks, and they're using them for their own profits. If you look at the rates across the United States, you will find, for example, they range from a per-call charge, and that is what we most object to. Besides the call per minute, there is a charge just for picking up the phone. That ranges from $3.95 per call charge, plus the additional per call, and we have the highest at $3.95 per call charge, plus the additional 89 cents per minute. That's in Georgia and Alabama. To going to Michigan and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, they have no per call charge, but their calls are still too expensive, far less expensive than Georgia and Alabama. Instead of 89 cents per minute, they are, in Michigan and the Bureau of Prisons, they are 23 cents per minute, but no per call charge. But recall that it is state prisons, perhaps 4 or 5 times the number of prisoners are in state prisons as in federal prisons. That's where most of the prisoners are, and most of those calls are likely to be calls intrastate. Now, those calls are going to go unregulated unless the FCC takes jurisdiction over what the statute says to take jurisdiction over, every completed intrastate and interstate call. If they did not, most prison systems would somehow have to manage 2 prison systems, one for unregulated calls, not by the FCC, one for regulated calls by the FCC. After more than 10 years of delay, in our letter we say that the FCC simply has no alternative but to establish fair and reasonable rates for intrastate and interstate calls. It's too late for Mrs. Wright and her grandson, although there has been a happy ending to their travail. The grandson is now a contributing member of to the District of Columbia economy because he works for Clark Construction. But there are hundreds of thousands of others, and they are represented by Celestine Johnson, whose son is currently incarcerated, and they, of course, are waiting relief, and we hope that the FCC will act promptly in order to ensure relief for those currently imprisoned. I'd like to go now to Representative Bobby Rush, who for years, I think the last 3 Congresses, in the absence of any movement by the FCC, despite the court suit that instructed the FCC to move, has come forward with a statute to compel the FCC to proceed to regulate these calls. Representative Bobby Rush of Illinois.
Thank you, Eleanor, and to Mrs. Wright and her son. Let me say that some of you might be aware I have served some time in prison. I know what it means to be isolated, miles away from home, and under segregation that's unimaginable, and not being able to connect with your loved ones. 10 or 15 years ago, I must say, Eleanor, these white citizens who were outside, they came to my office on this particular issue. And they came repeatedly to discuss this issue out of a sense of fairness and justice. And they were the ones who inspired me to introduce 4 Congresses ago to a bill to address this particular matter. They inspired me to, when the chiefs of police were coming in to discuss another issue, to question them from my perch on the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Telecom, to address them and ask them about these exorbitant prison rates. And all of them, in each and every hearing, refused to even consider remedies or reforming these rates, because they viewed these, in some instances, blood money, as being critical to their overall budgets. And they indicated without any hesitancy that they thought that if they would charge decent rates, or if anyone would charge decent rates or normal rates, that would hit their budgets in a detrimental way, in a negative way. And upon further investigation on my part, I found that most of them were using the dollars from these exorbitant rates as a slush fund, not for anything that had to do with the safety of the guards, the safety of the inmates, or the normal activities of the prisons, but in most instances as a slush fund for special activities and equipment. I'm so inspired by this wonderful lady, Mrs. Wright, and I'm inspired by my colleagues who are coming to the fore now to address this critical concern. Every year, 10,000 or more bills are introduced into the Congress, and only 4% are actually enacted into law. And the number decreases to about 1% when you eliminate the naming post offices and commemorative holidays. In spite of this, I have, again, stayed the course by introducing the Family Telephone Connection Protection Act for 4 straight Congresses. My bill will do several things in relation to prison phone calling rates and also services. Among other things, it would prescribe a minimum per minute rate that is to be paid to providers of inmate calling services. A maximum per minute rate. It will prescribe a maximum service per call or connection rate. It will prohibit the payment of commissions by inmate calling service providers to administrators of correctional facilities. And it will require administrators to allow more than one service provider at a time at any correctional facility to offer service and to generate lower calling rates through competition for those services. These are just some of the matters that we have been engaged in. I've repeatedly asked with varying levels of reaction and response for hearings on this particular bill. The FCC must do the right thing. I applaud Commissioner Clyburn for her valiant efforts on this behalf. But if the FCC fails in doing what it's supposed to do, it was given some basic rights over and responsibility and jurisdiction over all the telephones, which the public owns all the waves. It's not all the airwaves. It's a public utility. If the FCC fails to respond, then the Congress has to act by passing my bill. And so I thank all of those who are gathered here. I thank the working group. I thank Eleanor Holmes Norton and Marcia Fudge and others who are engaged in this particular matter. And most of all, Ms. Wright, I salute you and your grandson. There are too many families on fixed income right now who are put in the position to say yea or nay when they receive a collect call from somewhere in a faraway prison in this nation. And that family, that grandmother who's on a fixed income, must decide whether or not she or he is going to pay their rent, buy food, buy medication, or whether or not she is going to hear from her loved one and pay exorbitant costs for that sense of love. Grandparents, grandmamas, they know emphatically that one of the only things that keeps these young men and young women going is to hear the voice of their loved ones. There should not be this kind of choice, this kind of Hobson's choice, that we are forcing our families and our grandparents, for the most part, to be in. Congress must act.
Thank you very much, Representative Rush, and thank you especially for your leadership on this issue. It's been critical to moving the issue forward. Representative Rush mentioned Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. The Congressional Black Caucus is especially indebted to Commissioner Clyburn. She alone has carried this issue within the commission until this day when it's finally been recognized. We especially applaud her. And next, we'd like to hear from Representative Bobby Scott of Virginia.
Thank you, Eleanor, for your very kind introduction, and I want to thank Mrs. Wright for her courage in leading the charge against these unfair charges. With the advent of cell phones, most people stopped paying long-distance phone calls charges a long time ago. Yet those who want to speak to a prisoner have to pay those exorbitant fees. This is an expense many families can't afford. I serve as the ranking Democrat on the Crime Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, and we know that for those who are incarcerated, contact with a family is a significant factor in terms of reentry. So those inmates whose families and loved ones cannot afford the calls are less likely to successfully reenter in our society. So it's just unfair to the inmates and their families, as well as the taxpayer and potential victims, to have these citizens gouged with these kinds of unfair phone charges when they have no alternative than the exclusive phone service provided in the prisons. I want to thank Congresswoman Ellen Holmes Norton for putting the press conference together, my CBC colleagues, Chairman Marcia Fudge, Frank Johnson, and particularly Bobby Rush for his work on the offering a legislative fix to this problem over the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Scott, for your vigilance in this area, long-time vigilance in this area. The final speaker is Representative Hank Johnson. One of the states I cited as having the highest rates is the state of Georgia. Representative Hank Johnson from Georgia.
Thank you. What a dubious distinction. I want to thank Congresswoman Holmes Norton, Chairwoman Fudge, my colleagues Bobby Scott and Bobby Rush, and for that fine legislation that Bobby Rush has been pushing. I want to thank you all for holding this press conference today on such an important matter. I want to thank the civilians who have come to show their support. There are so many people like you who you are representing, and I think that your efforts will not be in vain. These astronomical fees are nothing more than low-level vulture capitalism. Predatory prison phone rates being perpetrated by phone companies in prisons are just plain wrong. Charging someone $17 to $20 to make a phone call is outrageous, and leveling a $250 to $350 per month phone bill is just untenable. I join everyone here today in rejecting this tax on the poorest in our society. Experience in life with a loved one imprisoned is already straining enough, but innocent family members and loved ones should not be punished with crippling phone charges just because their loved one is in prison. Studies show that inmates in regular contact with family and friends are less likely to reoffend if they are able to maintain relationships with their loved ones during their incarceration. Maintaining contact with family and friends during incarceration is therefore in the public interest. Making phone calls affordable for the more than 2 million children with at least one parent behind bars is so important to those children as well as to the inmates. They should be able to have regular contact with each other. This is almost, it forces some families to, due to the distance between them and their incarcerated loved one, they cannot go. And then if you can't afford to call, then it's pretty much a sentence of isolation for the inmate, and it just doesn't do anything to help society, and it's just lining the pockets of insiders who have no, they really have no right to punish innocent people in this way. I think it's time that we tackle this problem once and for all. And once again, I want to thank Bobby Rush for this legislation that he's been tirelessly working on. It's a toil on, young man, because it's going to pay off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative John. I think it has paid off because the FCC finally has moved, and I think our job now is to make sure it continues to move. Now, let me suggest this: when we asked the studio for this space, we submitted the names of all the people who would be speaking, and only when we got here did they tell us that the people who were frankly the featured speakers in the press conference, those who had experienced these calls, could not speak because only members of Congress can speak. So rather than the members of Congress standing here to take your questions, I would like to suggest that we go out of this studio so that you can speak directly to Ms. Wright and to her grandson and to Ms. Johnson, and hear what they would have said had they gained entry to this press conference. I must tell you, it was entirely the fault of the studio, because we submitted the names and only learned when everyone was here that they would be unable to speak. Actually, the most important thing you need, seems to me now, is to hear from them. So if you would follow us, we're going to take them out. Why don't you ask us out there?
Doing 18 years. Wow. Doing this 18 years, during these 18 years, it was rough. It was rough because being able to communicate with my grandmother, which is all I have, she's been there for me constantly. I was able to call home. She told me anytime I need to call home to pick up the phone. I can relate to what was being said earlier, because it's been times where she did have to choose over paying for medication in order to talk to me. So, that really does happen. I don't blame anybody for putting me in the position that I was in. Wholeheartedly, I accept my responsibility. But in doing so, it was just so unjust at the pain that my grandmother had to go through, because she's the one who had to pay the bills. She's the one who had to pick up the phone and fight with, can she afford to talk to me? Since I've been home, it's 10 months, I feel like I can't do enough for her. Because she's been everything for me, and she continued to be there for me. She's been my rock, she's been my support, and any and everything that I can do from this point on to help this situation, I just want to be able to pick up the torch and just keep it moving. Yeah, it may be too late for us, but there's many more people who's in the situation and will be in the situation. So, anytime that I'm able to say anything, to speak, to shake a hand, to show my face, I just want to be able to support the situation, because it's bad and it's ongoing. I love my grandmother to death. I am so happy that this is taking place, and that we're a family that's strong enough to be able to handle this. there's a lot of people who wouldn't be able to handle the situation. This is my grandmother, Mrs. Martha Wright.
Ms. Wright was the petitioner. You say a few words about your experience?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say that I had it rough by running. I had to trip from out of town to see him. Different places I had times I couldn't get to contact with him in Arizona. I had a time getting him on the phone to him, paying fare to New Mexico. I had a little time there. And then I've been also to Ohio, Pennsylvania, several other places where they have moved, and I traveled to find him. But I thank God when I found him. I tried, when I just started out with this organization, it was 10 of us. When it ended up seeming like I'm the only one, I say to the girls and the boys, I say, don't worry, something about to come through one day, because Rome wasn't built overnight. So it takes time for things to come through. But I'm so glad that they have started, because I almost had give up on this petition of what you're doing. But somehow it seems like the rest of them have passed on. Some too old in the home, they cannot get out. But thank God I'm able still to come out and try to hand a hand and do what I can do. Because I know it was tough trying to keep this organization when the Reverend Front Row, he the one that asked us about it at the time when it started in 2003. And then it all seemed like it was going up, the next it died down. But I'm glad that it's so far have come together and to begin to pick up. And I thank God to know that y'all is trying to do something about it. Because I do wish that the people would be able to fix it so Christmas, Valentine, and Mother's Day, the boys and girls will be able to have a call, free call, because they don't have, a lot of them don't have money to call their parents. I remember I called them and told them that my daughter had passed, that his mother had passed. They gave me the runaround, and I had to call 2 or 3 days, try to get him to let him talk on the phone. And that was ridiculous when you have to go through things like that. And I think something should be done that they should allow them for free calls out of the prison, because they make enough money to do things, and the government should allow them their call. That's all I have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Wright. Ms. Wright, before you ask any questions, could I let you hear from Ms. Celestine Johnson, whose son is currently incarcerated. When Ms. Wright spoke of several different prisons, because Yolandis was in the Bureau of Prisons, they transfer them from different facilities all during the time he was incarcerated. Ms. Johnson.
Good afternoon. My name is Celestine Johnson. My son's name is Daryl Bullock. He's located in McCrae, which is located in Pine Nut, Kentucky. On behalf of him and all of the inmates that are serving, female and male, I just want to say that he's just beginning an 8-year sentence, and I have not talked to him since February. Basically, we have to provide money for commissary, just about everything that they may need. You have to provide for them. So monitoring funding, I can say it's about like $500, because that's besides the phone. So alone they're also bombarded with the amount of time they can talk and how many calls they could talk. So during their coming in and being released, they try to communicate with their lawyers, they're trying to communicate with their children, their mothers, and it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. I have a daughter who's in college, so it's like the expenses that I have for him is just equates like to the expenses that I have on a monthly basis to try to help her while she's in college. So I urge the Congress, I urge FCC to just do what they need to do for people, because communication is the first lines of us being able to love each other with speech. America is built on the freedom of speech. Just because you're incarcerated, that right should not be abolished through the telecommunication system via the phone. When you're a parent and you hear your child's voice, you know how they're feeling. You know when they're sad. You know, you can feel it through the energy, through the sound waves of what to say to your child. So that being said, I'm honored that Congressman Norton had allowed me to be a part of this activity. I'm a native Washingtonian, born and raised, and from a child, I've always was taught that you have to be active in a community. I've always known that she's been on the forefront to help prisoners and the unfortunate people throughout my lifespan, which is 49 years at this present time. It's an honor to be here, and that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We can have your questions.
Congresswoman Norton, Mrs. Wright and Mr. Johnson both mentioned traveling to see their loved ones who are incarcerated.
I think that's right. Did she mean one phone call, or did she mean
she said she traveled as well.
She traveled as well.
And the point is that most correctional institutions are in remote rural areas, away from the urban areas where a lot of people live. And in the District of Columbia, it's even worse because it is not in a state institution, and D.C. inmates can be sent all over the country. And so does this make the problem worse because Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Wright were D.C. residents and their loved ones were sent far afield all over the United States?
Yeah. What's being referred to is the fact that the Bureau of Prisons houses D.C. prisoners, and of course they therefore are incarcerated all over the United States, making it very, very difficult to communicate. But even if you lived in New York or Chicago, the prison would not be in your city, and yet most of the inmates, or at least a disproportionate number, would come from the big cities. That's the way it's always been in America from the time there were immigrants to today. And so that means that yes, the fact that Ms. Wright would have to travel not only to a state, but then find her way to a remote part of the state only made travel that much harder. Now, if that's the case with travel, most people are not able to travel. This grandmother made enormous sacrifices in order to have contact with her grandson. Most just want the right to speak at a reasonable rate to their loved ones, both for their benefit and, as it turns out, for the benefit of society.
What do you think would be a reasonable rate?
She
said
have a
free.
reasonable rate.
What is reasonable?
Where's my reasonable rate? We actually call
0.07.
we call for the reasonable rate, and I thought you had passed out. We actually have the rate. She'll get you the rate.
It's 7 cents a minute.
7 cents a minute.
7 cents a minute with no per call.
No per call.
No per call rate. Imagine, what's the per call rate about? We think it's about kickbacks. We think it's about kickbacks. We think it's about profiteering.
On that point, you can often call to some Latin American and even African and European countries for lower rates than what people charge to call the inmates.
Within a state, yes. Because the rates I gave out, $3.95 per call, and those rates were those rates were local rates. So I'm not even talking about the rates if you have to call long distance.
You were saying even on a collect call, just for picking up the phone, there was a fee?
There's a $3.95 charge for the highest one. Some states don't have this per charge, but just picking up the phone.
What were the two companies? You said there were two companies that are getting most of the money. What were the two companies?
Securus Technologies and Global Telding.
Where do we go from here, Congresswoman? I mean, what are you confident that either the FCC or Congress can ameliorate the situation?
The courts have said that it is the FCC that has jurisdiction. And if you look at the breadth of that language, there's no doubt that they have the jurisdiction. Representative Rush filed his bill because the FCC wouldn't act. And he was saying if the FCC won't act, then Congress should act because the authority for the FCC to act comes from Congress. But undoubtedly, if Congress tried to act, they would say it's the FCC's jurisdiction now. And because of Ms. Wright, because of Representative Rush, finally, after more than 10 years, they have decided to act.
One of the counter arguments that I've read, I think this was in a state article, that some of this money is used to pay prisoners for their employment, for their wages. Is there any? Has there been any
Well,
study on that?
what you should remember about that is that this is discretionary money. So perhaps some of it goes to some good cause. For example, the Bureau of Prisons will tell us very specifically that it goes for a cause that we would all be for, related to the inmates. That's not our point. Our point is, first of all, this will be completely transparent. How much is it for the call, period? Why is there this vast difference from state to state? Notice it's the southern states where the kickbacks are worse. Why should there be kickbacks? If there is an added charge, then it should be transparent so that we understand what the charge is for. We also do not believe that inmate call money and the money from their relatives should be used to pay for prison services. That is an inappropriate use of money.
I asked just last week, I asked the chairman of the full committee, Fred Austin, I said, Fred, when are you going to give me a hearing? He said, Bobby, I support what you're trying to do, but my sheriffs and my wardens are totally against this bill, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I think we at least need to have a hearing, notwithstanding what the FCC is doing. But we should have the hearing in the Commerce Committee and also a hearing in the Judiciary Committee.
And when you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So this is minimally what needs to happen, so we can ferret out all the different issues. Because in the bottom line, on the bottom line rather, this is just another gimme to some budgetary interest of the Department of Corrections or to the prison system in the nation. And if we don't do something about it, it never will. It will always be this unholy alliance between these two companies and the local prisoners. And they're in cahoots together. So we have to break that alliance up, and that's what we're doing. And this is a good step in the process.
Pardon, ma'am, you mentioned commissary. There are other things that you have to pay for because I thought the state or the locality provided everything.
No, they don't. No, they don't.
Enlighten me.
They don't provide everything. Inmates, like, they'll allow them to have certain products like shoes and everything they have to pay for. So all of their cosmetics they have to pay for. A lot of the food is not applicable for them to even want to digest because of it's not healthy for them. So they would buy commissary food items as well that'll be better than what they're actually being fed.
Tampons are not provided by a lot of facilities.
Now, these are, would those who have also been incarcerated and their families raise their hands? These gentlemen heard about this press conference and also have been incarcerated. So we certainly invite you to speak with them after the press conference so you can get a broader sense. If we would have heard from them if we had been able to take everybody into that room.
Are all these calls done like collect, where like the prisoner calls and then the person at the other end has to accept charges, or can the prisoner like pay in advance and do this stuff?
This was going on that a lot of people don't know. I was in Arizona, CCA private prison, and what happens is there's been times that a phone call to be $30. My grandma was receiving 2 phone bills, the regular phone bill, and whatever these companies were doing, they have their own personal phone bill that they send her. I don't know how they do it, but and so she had to pay, regular phone bill and this phone bill just with the collect calls. At one time, they were selling us these debit cards. It may be for 25 minutes, but I make a phone call, it only lasts like 15 minutes, the phone cut off, but they charge us for the 25 minutes. They charge me for the whole phone call, and then they cut off, and when we call collect, instead of being $15 or $16 for this person beside me, it may charge her $40, $45. It used to be, real crazy. What they were saying about the commissary, only thing that you can send me in prison is money. They will sell you anything. But you can't even send me stamps. You can send me photos, but like magazines, you can't send me magazines. Everything has to come from the company. Never have to be paid for. So they provide everything. The little hotel bars of soap, they give you that once a week. You know, that doesn't last, especially for a man. A couple washes, that's it. But and the little those sample toothpaste, the little toothbrush you hold like that, that's what they provide. So you know, you have to pay for everything.
Are there any further questions?